This is week 3 and it is my 10-minute speech. I will be discussing the topics that we talked about in depth this week. We talked about our listening techniques as well as our voice capabilities and the proper ways to speak to people. We also touched on the topics for our informative speeches as well as how to develop our informative speeches, outline our informative speeches. So I'll be going into depth with those topics. They were important to me this week, specifically the listening as well as the vocal usage, because using your voice as well as listening properly will help when we are talking to people as well as being able to receive the information that we are trying to get from individuals when we are at a conference or when we are going to listen to someone else's speech, and making sure that we are able to retain and gain as much information as possible. So the first topic that I want to talk about is the usage of our voice. There are different variables when we are talking about in regard to using our voice, both in pitch, how high or low, how loud or soft you want to talk. And the reason why that we discussed that this week is because if you have a very high voice, people tend to not take you seriously when they listen to a speech that you might be giving, or even if you are a presenter or if you speak to the general public, they tend to disregard your information a little bit more just because they find the tone in which that you are presenting the information at to be not as received well. So the notes that we were provided this week suggested that you get a vocal coach or that you just practice at home to try and have your voice at a lower register, so that way when you are speaking to whoever, whether that be a group or if you're giving a speech or if you have to speak to the general public on a regular basis, that way that when you're at that lower register and you are calmer, they are able to receive the information that you are providing for them at a more comfortable level. And when you do that as well, they feel that you are a more knowledgeable and informative individual, and they are more able to receive said information from you completely. They also said that the more that you practice with that, the better that you will become with the fluidity of it. By that I mean when you are taking breaks with your voice, pauses specifically. I know that I have issues with pauses sometimes. Taking appropriate pauses are key when you are speaking, because you don't want the audience or even an individual that you are speaking with to either jump in or disengage in what you are trying to say if you are not finished with what you are saying. So you want to make sure that you're appropriately timing your pauses and not taking too long of a break. So that is something that is really important when you're using your voice. When we talk about our listening skills, we are talking about making sure that we are being active listeners. When we say active listening, we are making sure that our bodies are open, our postures are upright, we are giving proper eye contact with our speaker, we are taking notes, so that way we are continually engaging ourselves and our minds, so that way we are able to gain all of the information that we are being given from the speaker. When we aren't doing those things, we are either selective listening, which is something that I know a lot of parents do. I'm a parent myself, and I do this all the time, especially because I have an 11 and a 4-year-old, and sometimes when they ramble on and on, I just pick up the bits and pieces because sometimes they say things over and over again. So I just selectively listen. And when we are in a speech setting or even when we are at a conference, that is not something that we want to do. We also do not want to do another form of listening, which is argumentative listening, which is just basically you're only picking up the bits and pieces that we want to argue, because that's not something that you should really be doing as far as listening, just being someone who's just there to argue a point. We're there to learn and have a better base knowledge of whatever the speaker is trying to say. We also don't want to be an audience member who is just totally disengaged again. So that was something that we talked about when we are speaking in reference to being an appropriate listener. When we are talking about being a listener who is more engaged, they again are giving appropriate eye contact and just making sure that they are taking notes during the whole speech at all times. So it's really important that we do this throughout every single thing, even if it's something that we might not think that is interesting to us. We have to try and apply it back to how can this function in some way in our lives. We also discussed this week our informative speeches, topics that we could possibly pick from, as well as how to outline our speeches. And some of the topics that we had as a suggestion were a biography, a how-to, a process. So those were some of the topics that we talked about. And for a biography, the suggestions were to pick from someone that had enough information that we could not only have enough points to talk on, but also be able to gain enough references from. That goes for all of our speeches, no matter which topic we decided to pick from. But another thing that we talked about as well was making sure that no matter what topic we picked, it was a topic that wasn't going to offend anyone, because we want to make sure that the informative speech is only to provide knowledge to our classmates and not to offend anyone, because this is a safe space and this initial speech is, again, just to inform everyone, and we don't want to upset anybody or spark a debate, because that's not the point of what we're trying to accomplish. So that's something that we need to all keep in the back of our minds. For our how-tos and processes, the process was more along the lines of going how something is made specifically piece by piece, and then the how-to would be more along the lines of how to make something or how to garden. So those were definitely some good suggestions for everybody moving forward. When we talked about how to outline our speeches, it was more along the lines of the flow of the speech, whether it be cause and effect, or if it was going to be along a timeline, whether it began during this era and then moved forward to current times, etc., etc. So it was just more of how are we going to start and how are we going to finish. I think that for everything that we talked about during this week, it was extremely important for us to be mindful of the way that we use our voice, again, especially with the pauses, because we don't want to disengage our audience or lose them at any point or have them think that we're finished. And that it's always important to be mindful that when we are listening, to stay actively engaged, even if we don't feel like what is being discussed is something that might apply to us at the time, we have to try and remember that what the individual is speaking on could apply to us at some point in time. So we can loop it back to something to us later in time. And that's why we take the notes and keep eye contact, etc. So that is something that I will keep in the back of my head moving forward, especially with these informative speeches. Not everything will apply to us right now, but maybe someday in the future it will. Thank you.